Coronation Street teases that Debbie Webster will soon face a battle that's more than just emotional, one that forces her to confront not only her body, but her very identity. It all began with subtle signs, almost imperceptible at first. A missed appointment here, a forgotten name there. Debbie, ever the sharp and commanding businesswoman, refused to believe these could be anything more than stress or overwork. But the reality clawed at her relentlessly. She was losing parts of herself, and she knew it. Behind the closed doors of her flat above the bistro, Debbie grappled with the terrifying notion that something was truly wrong. There were times she found herself staring at invoices for the hotel, unable to decipher numbers she once knew like the back of her hand. She mislaid keys, repeated conversations without remembering, and once left the water running until it flooded half her bathroom. Still, she told no one. The idea of being pitied, of being seen as vulnerable or worse, a burden, was unbearable. Kevin, her half-brother, had his own worries. Debbie placed him at the center of her concerns, especially since he confided in her about his supposed cancer diagnosis. She became obsessed with helping him through what she believed were his final months, even neglecting her own worsening condition in the process. Her sense of duty shielded her from acknowledging her decline, and any suggestion otherwise was met with a brick wall of denial. What devastated her most was when she discovered the truth: Kevin had lied. The cancer scare was fabricated, born from his desperation for attention and sympathy after years of being sidelined. Debbie's devastation was volcanic. She had invested all her emotional reserves into protecting him, only to be met with betrayal. This revelation, rather than freeing her to focus on herself, hardened her resolve to hide her illness even more. Ronnie, ever the caring yet practical partner, was the first to suspect that something wasn't right. He watched as Debbie became uncharacteristically erratic, overly emotional at times and distant at others. He gently suggested she see someone, maybe take some time off the hotel operations. Debbie lashed out at the suggestion. She couldn't be seen as fragile. She refused to be someone who crumbled. The breaking point came during a confrontation with a particularly difficult guest at the Chariot Square Hotel. The guest had asked for a simple room change, something routine, but Debbie exploded with misplaced rage, accusing the guest of harassment and threatening to call the police. The guest, clearly taken aback, recorded part of the encounter. It soon made its rounds on social media, drawing unwanted attention to the hotel and Debbie's erratic behavior. Ryan, who had been working under Debbie for several months, stepped in quickly. With an almost uncanny diplomacy, he de-escalated the situation and offered the guest a generous discount and an upgrade to smooth things over. It worked. The guest agreed to delete the video and not pursue legal action. Debbie, mortified but grateful, pulled Ryan aside later that night and did something entirely out of character: she kissed him. Ryan stood frozen, unsure how to respond. Debbie, clearly emotional and riding the wave of adrenaline, tried to pass it off as a thank you, but the damage had already been done. Ryan, ever the professional, didn't push the matter further in the moment, but the next day, he met with Ronnie in private. Ryan confessed everything: the kiss, the outburst, and his growing concerns. Ronnie listened intently, eyes shadowed with worry. He had his suspicions, but hearing them confirmed by someone else made it real. He asked Ryan to keep an eye on Debbie, but also encouraged him to urge her toward professional help. They both knew this couldn't go on much longer. Not only was Debbie risking her own health, but she was also jeopardizing the reputation and profitability of the hotel they had all worked so hard to build. Debbie, however, was far from ready to accept help. When Ryan gently approached the subject with her, she grew defensive, almost paranoid. She questioned his loyalty, accused him of talking behind her back, and insisted that she was fine. Ryan, trying his best to stay calm, warned her that not everyone would be as understanding as him. The hospitality business was brutal, and a single incident could sink them. Rather than listen, Debbie stormed off and found solace in an old vice, alcohol. She sat alone in the Rovers, nursing drink after drink, convincing herself that everyone else was overreacting. But deep inside, she knew the truth. Things were slipping, she was slipping, and no amount of denial could stitch the cracks together. Ronnie, now desperate, made a final plea. He begged Debbie to check herself into a hospital, to at least get a diagnosis. They could work through it together. Debbie refused again, her voice shaking with fury and fear. But Ronnie, who had reached his breaking point, took matters into his own hands. He told Kevin. The fallout was immediate. Debbie felt ambushed. Her shame and fury boiled over as she screamed at Ronnie for betraying her trust. Kevin, stunned and guilt-ridden, tried to comfort her, but she pushed him away. Her worst fear had come true. She was now the vulnerable one, the object of pity. But with no other option and mounting pressure from both Ronnie and Kevin, Debbie eventually, and reluctantly, checked herself into the hospital. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, or a violent outburst that sent her there, but something much more heartbreaking, resignation. As she lay in the sterile hospital room, staring at the ceiling with blank eyes, the woman who once ran an empire with iron will and fierce pride now felt hollowed out by uncertainty. What would happen to her hotel? Her independence? Her mind? The journey ahead would be one of painful introspection and reluctant acceptance. And yet, somewhere beneath the confusion and fear, a tiny ember of determination still burned. Debbie Webster had faced fire before. The question now was whether she could rise from these ashes, or be consumed by them. The days following Debbie's reluctant hospitalization moved slowly, each hour stretching into an eternity. The clinical setting only magnified her frustration. Despite the quiet encouragement from her neurologist and the thoughtful tone of the mental health team, she kept her emotions sealed behind a cold, stony silence. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. But the numbness in her expression was its own form of collapse. Ronnie visited every day, bringing her magazines and stories from the hotel, hoping to keep her connected to the world she was avoiding. She tolerated his presence, but said little. Every time he brought up the possibility of returning to work after some proper rest and assessment, her jaw would tighten. She hadn't given up, at least not completely. But she didn't trust herself anymore. Kevin arrived a few days later, guilt etched into every word. He didn't come bearing excuses. Instead, he sat with her quietly, acknowledging the pain he'd caused by inventing his illness. It had been a moment of weakness, he confessed. A desperate cry for attention in a world where he constantly felt overlooked. Debbie didn't answer. Her silence said more than fury ever could. Yet, when he stood to leave, she didn't stop him either. That alone was a mercy. Back at the hotel, Ryan had found himself in an increasingly complicated position. With Debbie out, the responsibility of running day-to-day operations fell partially to him and partially to a very overstretched Ronnie. But more than that, Ryan felt trapped in a moral limbo. He'd become the quiet confidant to both sides, Ronnie's trusted voice of reason and Debbie's reluctant ally. Still, his unease grew with each passing day. Guests had begun to murmur. Though the viral video had been quietly removed, the damage lingered in whispers. Staff had noticed the shift too, the way Ryan had stepped in, how Debbie had vanished. Some were sympathetic. Others smelled instability and feared layoffs. Ryan did his best to keep morale steady, but he wasn't a miracle worker. The hardest part was the residual weight of Debbie's kiss. It wasn't about romance, at least not in the traditional sense. It had been desperation, gratitude, maybe even a plea for closeness at a time she felt herself drifting from reality. But still, Ryan couldn't shake the image. It lingered, muddled with guilt and a creeping sense of duty. Ronnie pulled him aside one evening after they'd closed up. The two men sat in the office, surrounded by stacks of invoices and empty coffee cups. "She's not herself anymore," Ronnie muttered, his voice heavy with defeat. Ryan nodded. "I don't think she's ever been more herself. Just the parts she doesn't want anyone to see." Ronnie ran a hand over his face. "If the treatment doesn't work, if it progresses, what then? She won't be able to run this place." "You know that," Ryan said quietly. "We'll have to find someone. Or sell." Ronnie flinched at the word. Meanwhile, Debbie was undergoing rigorous cognitive tests. Her doctors weren't ready to make a definitive diagnosis, but early-onset Alzheimer's, or a similar neurodegenerative disorder, was high on the list. The uncertainty gnawed at her worse than the symptoms. If she had a name for the monster, she could fight it. But drifting in a limbo of maybes and potential prognoses, she felt like a ghost of herself. It was during one of those long, restless nights in the hospital that Debbie received a visitor she didn't expect, Kevin. Again. This time, he brought something more than apologies. He came with news. "Ronnie's thinking about shutting the place down," he said softly. He's not saying it outright, but it's there. Debbie's eyes narrowed. "He wouldn't. He's scared, Debs. We all are. You being gone, it's like someone's pulled the anchor." Debbie stared at the ceiling. "Maybe I'm not the anchor anymore." Kevin took a shaky breath. "Then tell him that. Don't let him make decisions in your silence." It stirred something inside her. Weak as she felt, disoriented as her brain sometimes became, Debbie still had the fire. She'd built that hotel, fought to keep it running, and earned every brick in its foundation. If it was going to fall, it would fall on her watch, not behind her back. The next day, she requested a supervised visit outside the hospital. The doctors were hesitant, but ultimately agreed. Ronnie and Ryan met her outside, shocked to see her, pale but determined, standing in front of the car. "I need to see it," she said. "Take me to the hotel." The moment she stepped inside, everything shifted. The staff tried not to stare, but her presence was electric. Some whispered, some smiled warmly, but all eyes followed her as she moved through the lobby. She asked to see the books. She wanted to know the numbers, the feedback, the fallout. Ryan complied, and they spent 2 hours poring over spreadsheets together in her old office. She didn't absorb everything perfectly, but she saw enough to know the situation wasn't as dire as they feared. The turning point came when she stood before the staff, unannounced, unpolished, and unafraid. "I'm not going to pretend I've been well," she began, voice steady. "But I'm still here. I might not remember every detail, or every name the way I used to. But I remember who I am. And I remember why I built this place. It deserves better than secrecy. And so do all of you." There was a long silence. Then, Ryan clapped. Slowly, deliberately. Others followed. It wasn't unanimous trust. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was enough. In the weeks that followed, Debbie remained under part-time observation. She wasn't declared medically fit to return full-time, but she began a phased comeback, working with Ryan and Ronnie to share responsibilities. The three formed an unlikely trio, each carrying a piece of the burden. Ronnie, now cautious but more hopeful, kept a closer eye on Debbie without smothering her. Ryan, driven by respect more than affection, continued to be the quiet pillar she leaned on. And Kevin, shamed by his earlier deceit, began volunteering to help around the hotel, desperate to make amends. Debbie's condition didn't vanish. Her memory faltered. She sometimes lost track of meetings or repeated a question she'd already asked. But she'd also started treatment. Medication, therapy, structure, all designed to keep her stable for as long as possible. And something else changed, her acceptance. She no longer hid. She no longer kissed people out of panic, or shouted to cover confusion. Instead, she started talking, really talking, about her fears, her anger, and her hopes. The road ahead would be fragile. There would be setbacks. Days when she felt lost or unwanted. But Debbie Webster, battered and bruised as she was, had chosen to fight. Not in silence. Not alone. Coronation Street would watch, as it always had, as another of its strongest women faced a storm with her back straight and her heart exposed.